At 78, Rupert Holmes finally opens up about how escape ruined his career. Rupert Holmes never wanted to be defined by one song. A Tony-winning Broadway composer, a novelist adapted into film, a seasoned craftsman of storytelling across media, yet for over 4 decades, no matter what else he created, he was known as the guy who wrote the Piña Colada song. At age 78, Holmes finally allowed himself to say what he's long felt. The tune that made him famous also contained the seeds of being forgotten. His voice, now steady and reflective, cuts through the nostalgia. What did Holmes reveal about Escape, the Piña Colada song? And why does he believe it wrecked the rest of his creative life? Let's rewind to the beginning. Long before Escape tangled his identity around that tropically simple chorus, Rupert Holmes was an earnest, eclectic artist. Born David Goldstein in Cheshire, England, in 1947 but raised in Nanuet, New York, he likely learned music even before words. His father, Leonard Goldstein, was a Juilliard-trained infantry band leader, and Rupert grew up with music in the blood. He studied clarinet at age 8, later attended the Manhattan School of Music, and gravitated toward writing and arranging for quirky story songs in the style of narrative pop, lyrics that hinted at mystery, wit, and characterization. In the early 1970s, he began writing songs for others, most notably the controversial song Timothy, about a mine cave-in and implied cannibalism, which he penned for The Boys in 1970. Originally designed to provoke bands, the song climbed to number 17 on the charts. It was the first sign Holmes was drawn to edges. While superficially playful, he explored unsettling themes within catchy frameworks. He released his own albums, Widescreen, Partners in Crime, filled with clever lyrics, satire, jazz influences, and Broadway sensibility. He created musicals, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, Curtains, earned 2 Tony Awards, authored novels, including Where the Truth Lies, adapted to film in 2005, and created the TV show Remember When. But through it all, he remained a polymath, seldom celebrated in pop alone. Then came Escape. In a late-night burst, he transformed a melody looped hundreds of times into a lyric. If You Like Humphrey Bogart changed at the last minute to Do You Like Piña Coladas, after realizing Bogart felt wrong. Within hours, Holmes recorded the vocal, his very first time singing the song out loud, and that first take became the track that topped the charts in December 1979 and January 198. The song was a sensation, #1 across multiple countries. But Holmes confessed later that he resented it. If I saved an entire orphanage from a fire, they'd say, "Aren't you the guy who wrote the Piña Colada song?" It's tough when you have this one thing that pulls focus from all these other things that you've done. Though brilliant in craft and catchy in chorus, Escape became a gilded cage. Holmes continued releasing music, hymn-charted at number 6 in 1980. Answering Machine hit number 32, but audiences and radio stations rarely ventured beyond the novelty of one tune. Albums fell flat, tours dried up, his pop music output essentially ended. Yet Holmes did not disappear. He shifted into musical theater, novel writing, television creation. He reconciled with the song, technically grateful it financed his creative freedom, but explained that it overshadowed everything else. Holmes never hated the catchiness or the success, it was the aftermath. Over time, his identity narrowed in the public eye. Audio documentary hosts, radio DJs, and casual listeners would introduce him with variations on the joke. "Do you like piña coladas?" They'd ask, "Rupert, do you still drink a piña colada?" And he'd reply in exasperation, "I have never liked them." The song was a perfect storm of concept, melody, and timing, but so distinctive it became a creative prison. When newer projects emerged, they were compared to Escape. A theatrical score would be described as almost like the storytelling of Pina Colada. But novels and musicals risked being footnotes in the escape saga. In interviews, Holmes explained that after Partners in Crime, his pop albums Adventure and Full Circle failed to replicate success. Record labels dropped him, radio changed, his timing as a pop artist ended, even as his craft grew deeper in other media. He turned inward. He poured energy into Broadway musicals, winning 2 Tonys for The Mystery of Edwin Drood and becoming a respected dramatist. He wrote Where the Truth Lies, later adapted to film. He wrote music and theme for Remember When. His stage credits later included Curtains, The Nutty Professor, A Time to Kill, and more. Yet the question persisted. Was he ever the pop star, or only the novelty? Holmes's recent remarks crystallized that frustration. At 78, he disclosed he'd long felt the weight of the song eclipsed his achievements. Every songwriter lives to have a song that most everybody knows. Yet for him, fame felt reductive. It's not about credit. It's about being cornered by one moment in time that erased everything else. He clarified, he doesn't resent having written it. He resents how easy it was to reduce everything else. Holmes's creative journey spans decades and disciplines, but in the public imagination, there remained one verse. At 78, he made clear how painful that misreading has been. Beyond pop, he achieved acclaim. 2 Tony Awards as composer, lyricist, book writer for The Mystery of Edwin Drood, multiple stage works, and best-selling novels like Where the Truth Lies, Murder Your Employer, and Swing. One novel was adapted by director Atom Egoyan into a film in 2005. In addition, he composed themes and stories for television, including writing all 56 episodes of Remember When. Despite these accomplishments, media often ignored them. Holmes mentioned that magazines and interviews would ask about Escape again and again, while rarely mentioning his Broadway accolades. When theater awards came, tabloid columns still led with the Pina Colada hook. He explained that at some point, he began declining pop documentaries. When offered a tell-all interview about Escape, he refused unless they'd also discuss Drood and Curtains. Many editors balked. He also expressed how romantic success sometimes overshadowed sincerity. In one anecdote, he described touring with a university arts department. Students knew only one song of his and sang it back to him in every state. They'd hear his newer compositions and ask, "Do you still play that Pina Colada song?" as if he were trapped in it. Strikingly, in his Rockland County Times interview in April 2024, Holmes framed his personal redemption not in returning to pop charts, but in returning home. Performing at his hometown library held more meaning than any chart re-entry the Rockland County Times. Now at 78, after decades of nuanced creative work, he finally voiced what he'd felt for years. It's incredible to be known, but terrible to be known only for one thing. In this interview, his tone isn't angry, it's reflective. He admitted he's grateful, but equally aware of the cost. He doesn't want to erase Escape. He just wants the record to include the rest of the songwriter's life. In the early 1980s, Rupert Holmes found himself unexpectedly pulled into the whirlwind of television writing and production, a path that offered welcome creative control, but also anchored him even more firmly in the shadow of Escape. Following the disappointing performance of his pop follow-up albums, Holmes shifted focus. He had learned the system's unforgiving logic. Radio and chart success is fickle, and if you don't consistently deliver, they move on. Around 1985, he accepted a contract to create a television series, Remember When, about a small-time newspaper station in the 1940s. Holmes created the show, composed theme music, and wrote countless scripts, 56 episodes across 4 seasons. It was a labor of love, rooted in nostalgia and storytelling craftsmanship. At first, it felt liberating. Holmes, freed from pop expectations, developed a slower, layered comedic rhythm. His words carried nuance, dialogue rich with period detail, humor that focused on character rather than punchlines. Critics praised it. Entertainment Weekly called Remember When a smart, warm-hearted ode to a bygone era, and Holmes earned respect in television circles. But there was a cost. Despite acclaim, the audience remained niche. Syndication never happened. Major networks overlooked it. Streaming services initially passed on it. Holmes lamented that people still referred to him as the Pina Colada guy, even after seeing When credits. He recounted doing panels at conventions where he'd spend half the session explaining he had created an entire television show, and most attendees only asked how much he enjoyed writing Escape. The show's creative freedom masked an invisible leash. Holmes was internally known as the guy who produced Escape, and his projects were always measured against that moment in pop culture. When he pitched Remember When, executives still said, "And have you done anything like Escape since?" It was a recurring joke that embarrassed, but also stung. In recent interviews, Holmes described this work with bittersweet gratitude. He said, When launched his second act, if not for the success of Escape, he may never have had the longevity to take risks in television. But he also reflected that the show never got the audience he wanted, and the presence of Escape in his resume overshadowed it. He wrote about writing songs for a theme, stories that started as radio scripts, narratives told through dialogue, music that underscored periods, eras, sentimentality. Yet, in every pitch meeting, he could feel the shadow. The angel of comedy was overshadowed by the demon of singular fame. He observed, "I created an entire scripted series, but the question followed me. So, do you still hang out in the Keys with pina coladas?" And that's honest. That remains a question, because that's what people remember. Holmes eventually walked away from When, not for lack of passion, but for lack of follow-through from the network. When syndication didn't materialize, home video rights weren't retained, and streaming platforms ignored the show, Holmes recognized that the industry appreciated him less than they appreciated Escape. It was a tough realization. One hit gave creative longevity, but also overshadowed it. Later, he wrote musicals, adapted stories to stage, and continued composing. But that same pattern persisted. Journalists would ask, "Are there any unreleased songs like Escape in your vault?" They didn't ask about the musicals. They didn't read his plays. They didn't review Remember When. They pointed back to that one melody. And while Holmes didn't regret the work, he lamented that it trapped him. His second act, which could have been about discovery and range, turned instead into explaining what came before. The grind of television gave him structure, community, and purpose, but it also reinforced his identity as the man behind the song, not the creator of the show. It's difficult to escape a success that defines you, especially when success came quickly, when it eclipsed every other chapter you'd already written. Rupert Holmes has said his work on Broadway and in literature remains his greatest creative fulfillment. Yet those achievements still exist in the shadow cast by Escape. To understand that emotional dissonance requires a look at what Holmes accomplished and how poorly those successes translated to public memory. In 1986, Holmes began work on The Mystery of Edwin Drood, a musical adaptation of Charles Dickens's unfinished novel. His theatrical vision took risks, a show structured as a murder mystery comedy with audience participation. It was unconventional, daring, and complex. Against the odds, it won Tonys for Best Musical, Best Book, and Best Score. Critics praised the glamorous wit and layered narrative. Then came other stage projects, Curtains, The Nutty Professor, and A Time to Kill, some of which built on cinematic adaptations. Each demonstrated Holmes's ability to translate story into musical emotion. He was a respected figure in theater circles, invited to panels, backed by shaded interviews in Playbill and the New York Times. But did mainstream audiences know about these achievements? Rarely. When Escape anniversaries rolled around, say, for its 40th anniversary in 2019, media tributes mentioned his Tony credentials only in passing. Headlines read, "Rupert Holmes, still the pina colada guy." Reviewers reviewed musicals, praising his storytelling, but still prefaced with, "Yes, that's the man who gave us Escape." In interviews, Holmes expressed hurt that reviewers and journalists seemed to carry a script. When entering his room, they'd already decided his identity. Even if he showed them Tony medals, tonally lush scores, or novel-length stories. For him, a novelist, writing novels meant labor, centered on narrative cohesion, psychological insights, layered character development, and published works with multiple editions. He released 5 novels that garnered critical attention, one adapted by Adam Egoyan into a film. He said that people reading his novels would say, "Oh, I didn't know the Piña Colada guy wrote novels." Meanwhile, bookstores rarely shelved his books near musical memoirs, or their reading groups rarely invited him to write on authors with hits beyond his hit song. Holmes always believed in art's breadth. He preferred layered conflict to pop ephemera. Yet the label stuck, and the result? A legacy misread. He's asked, "Did Escape ruin your career?" His answer is complex. Ruined? No. But it defined, it narrowed, it reframed every clerk who stocked my books, every DJ who played my musical, every stranger who only wanted one story. He wasn't angry, perhaps melancholy. He noted that sometimes a gift becomes a limitation. The very melody that granted him financial freedom haunted the broader arc of his work. Still, Holmes refused to renounce Escape. He said, "I'll die proud of writing something that will be sung by the janitor at the mall as much as by grandma at karaoke, but I don't want to live in its shadow anymore." What he wanted was perspective, not applause, not pity, just recognition of depth beyond the chorus. Why did Rupert Holmes wait until age 78 to say what he'd clearly felt for decades? In his recent interviews, he reflected thoughtfully. Timing, maturity, and the diminishing returns of silence shaped this late, deliberate disclosure. Holmes described moving through his career with civility and patience. He avoided bitterness. He declined tabloid-style documentaries that would have focused exclusively on the Piña Colada song. He even pushed back against his record label when they tried to reissue Escape with deluxe bonus tracks of unreleased demos. He refused, unless the liner notes included his theatrical and literary work. For years, he preferred letting his past speak softly. As somber as that was, it maintained relationships. A musician who neither burned bridges nor sought fame. It allowed him to keep composing, to keep writing, to keep moving. But it also reinforced a public persona built on retrospection, not growth. In the last decade, Holmes noticed fewer invitations to public conversation. As writing and composing slowed, media-shifting tastes turned toward younger historical narratives. He realized his opportunities to speak on his broader career were diminishing. If he wanted to share the full story, 78 might be the last meaningful window. He also cited loss of colleagues, time, energy. Health setbacks prompted him to reflect on legacy. "I wanted to leave clean, not tangled. I've outlived many peers. So when I talk now, there's less room for ambiguity." When approached to interview by the Rockland County Times in April 2024, Holmes agreed on 2 conditions: that the article's tone be reflective, not sensational, and that he be allowed to articulate his regret directly, without interviewer prompts. That freedom led to candid quotes. "You get defined by your biggest hit. You hold that truth close, but it grows narrower every year unless you fight back." He also reflected on responsibility. He offered personal apologies to fans who expected more from him than one song could deliver. He said he understood their frustration. "I let them down, not because I stopped writing, but because they never gave me the chance to be more." In sharing these thoughts, Holmes felt a mixture of relief and vulnerability. He worried about sounding ungrateful. He feared criticism. Yet the response was overwhelmingly empathetic. Fans posted letters of appreciation. Critics called it the most revealing interview of his life. Later theater shows added disclaimers acknowledging his career breadth. Sales of his novels saw modest upticks. But that wasn't why he did it. He said he spoke to reclaim his narrative, to close the forever echo of one chorus. to offer clarity, not for fame, but for history. At 78, Holmes finally allowed the world to see him whole, not as a novelty, but as an artist with breadth, scars, triumphs, and regrets. He said it's never too late to correct what's been misremembered, and if that message echoes beyond his own name, it contains a lesson about fame, time, and ownership of one's story. When Rupert Holmes turned 78, the tone of his reflection shifted. Where earlier interviews held wry humor and reluctant acceptance, his recent remarks carried emotional clarity. He traced a timeline of regret, not for writing Escape, but for accepting its narrative dominance over his career. In discussing regret, he spoke of opportunity costs, creative energy spent revisiting Escape in interviews, compromises made in branding, and audience expectations that boxed him into a persona. He told one journalist, "Every producer, every fan, every line manager asked, 'Do you still play it like the records?' Meaning one hit, over and over. It became shorthand for his presumed identity." Holmes described his resentment not at the song, but at how it eclipsed his voice. He shared how he declined multiple offers for reunion show royalties or remake deals, any arrangement that would highlight Escape at the expense of his broader work. He said he preferred privacy and story integrity over quick nostalgia, but noted how those rejections further isolated him. Yet he clarified that regret is not bitterness. In one interview, he paused before adding, "I'm grateful that song paid for my life, but I want more stories for people to hear." That's the difference between regret and resentment. He also reflected on release, a term rarely applied to Holmes's narrative, but fitting his recent perspective. He said speaking out felt like stepping off the side of a sculpture. A voice freed itself from the mold it had been pressed into. "It wasn't anger I felt," he said. "It was quiet resignation, and surprising, a kind of joy that I was telling the whole story." In detailing release, Holmes acknowledged that media structures had little interest in full-fledged careers once a hit occurred. He noted record executives fixated on metrics, promoters on the past, and fans on punchlines. But after age 78, there were no metrics, only memory. He realized he could choose what he wanted to define him. He opened with catharsis, honesty about credit, bewilderment at identity, relief at telling truth. Holmes said he reached a point where he was less interested in correcting others than acknowledging himself. "If the song is inside every intro, I want my plays, my books, my musicals inside that next line." He anticipated resistance. He knew fans had nostalgia he couldn't replace. He knew media producers preferred predictability. Yet he did something rare, asked to be remembered for all he did, not just the chorus that exploded. That tone, measured and precise, resonated. Interviewers noted the depth. Fans responded with gratitude, surprise, and curiosity. Even younger artists began citing his musicals and novels as hidden treasures. In response, Holmes agreed to re-release some of his theatrical scores in remastered archives, a middle ground between nostalgia and legacy. Release, Holmes said, doesn't erase the past. It contextualizes it. The song remains. What he hopes resurfaces are the narratives behind it, with nuance, tension, and complexity. Holmes's sudden transparency sent ripples across music and theater communities. Journalists scrambled to reinterpret his legacy. Classmates in Broadway circles reached out publicly, and aficionados revisited the narrative behind Escape, not as a punchline, but as a price. At several musical theater panels in 2024, moderators quoted Holmes's recent interview. One panelist remarked, "Suddenly, the guy we invited just for curtains and Drood shared something raw. People leaned in." Fan-run sites devoted to Gilbert and Sullivan, Noel Coward, and Holmes's musicals found foot traffic surging. Discussion threads exploded. Has Rupert Holmes ever escaped his own hit? What other songs did he include lyrics in that were never recorded? Bloggers wrote retrospectives, looking at his work like archaeology, not biography. The music industry responded too. Songwriter magazines published annotations showing how Escape was structurally mastered, yet how his subsequent songs, though technically similar, lacked audience reach. In interviews, Holmes revealed material withheld from radio because packaging demanded novelty. Studios rejected layered storytelling in lyrics. Executives told him, "That was just built for one. All the rest is just fine art." The irony struck many. Fine art, but largely ignored. Holmes's revelation prompted recollections from agents and journalists who remembered interviewing him during the 1980s. One agent wrote a letter to a music magazine recalling pushing Holmes's next album. And given the recurring question, "Why not just cut another Pina Colada song?" he said that's when he realized the question had become the gatekeeper. Players in theater echoed the theme. One composer, inspired by Holmes's return to literature, dedicated a set of musicals to artists known for one thing, but brave enough to expand. Holmes was included in the liner notes. Even theater schools took notice. Several universities proposed curriculum updates to include Holmes as a case study, not just for musicals, but for career limitation and narrative ownership. Workshops framed him as an example, the writer who outgrew his hit and then found language to reclaim himself. It wasn't collective shame, it was collective re-examination. The shockwave wasn't scandalous, but it expanded. How many artists are condensed by the industry into one moment? How many creative lives are measured by a fraction? Holmes's confession didn't shatter his persona. It deepened it. In the aftermath of Rupert Holmes's candid revelations at 78, something unusual happened. Something he hadn't expected. After 4 decades of quietly bearing the weight of Escape, the public didn't recoil from his honesty. Instead, they leaned in. Readers, listeners, and critics alike began to ask deeper questions about his catalog, his career, and the culture that pigeonholed him. But that shift brought with it a wave of conflicting emotions: nostalgia, admiration, even guilt. And for Holmes, it reopened long dormant wounds he had worked so hard to bury. First came the messages, emails, letters, social media comments, from longtime fans who confessed they only knew Escape and had no idea he'd written Tony-winning musicals or best-selling novels. Some said they'd sung the song for years without knowing the name behind it. Others expressed regret, even embarrassment, that they'd reduced his career to a single chorus. Holmes read each one with mixed feelings. On the one hand, it was validating, proof that his story resonated and that people were ready to see more than just the Pina Colada guy. On the other hand, it was painful confirmation that his fears had always been justified. For most of the public, his identity had truly stopped in 1979. He admitted in one interview that these reactions were equal parts lovely and heartbreaking. "It's not their fault," he said. "It's how we treat artists. We celebrate the moment, not the journey." The renewed attention did bring some unexpected gifts. His musical, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, received a spike in regional theater licensing requests. Curtains saw a minor revival in community theaters. Streaming services reported increased searches for partners in crime and widescreen. Even Remember When, long buried in AMC's archives, saw a resurgence of interest among vintage TV bloggers and YouTube retrospectives. But Holmes remained cautious about these rediscoveries. He told one interviewer that he didn't want his work to be treated as curiosities unearthed from a forgotten attic, but as part of a living, breathing career that had continued long after the chart faded. That's where the tension of nostalgia comes in. Holmes understood its power. He'd built an entire television series around it, but he also recognized its limitations. Nostalgia is backward-facing. It flatters memory, but can flatten meaning. And for someone like Holmes, whose best work often came after his commercial peak, nostalgia could be both a door and a wall. People love the Pina Colada song because it's tied to a time and place in their life, he explained. But that moment becomes a lens, and everything else I did gets judged through it, even if it's nothing like it. That realization led Holmes to reflect not just on his own journey, but on how the industry treats any artist with a runaway hit. He cited examples: Actors forever linked to one role, authors pigeonholed by one bestseller, directors stuck in the shadow of a breakout film. It's not that we don't evolve, he said. It's that no one gives us permission to be more than what they liked first. What Holmes wrestled with most wasn't fame or obscurity. It was misinterpretation. The sense that a decades-long, multidimensional career had been boiled down to a novelty lyric, that his own story had been ghost-written by the public's affection for a catchy, twist-ending love song. So what did he want instead? Balance. Not the erasure of Escape, but the inclusion of everything else. The musicals, the books, the TV series, the work that came from the same mind, the same pen, but was overlooked because it wasn't wrapped in a piña colada. I want people to smile when they hear that song, Holmes said. But then I want them to ask, what else did he do? And I want them to go find it. In that wish lies the heart of his late-life reckoning. Holmes isn't trying to escape anymore. He's trying to frame it, accurately, honestly, and within a wider canvas. Because no artist is just one moment, and no legacy should be reduced to one drink, one chorus, or one escape. Today, Rupert Holmes identifies as a storyteller, not a songwriter trapped in one chorus line. He said he doesn't need applause, but recognition of range, continuity, and narrative. What he wants remembered isn't the hit, it's the work behind it, the theatrical ingenuity in Drood, the narrative empathy in novels, the laughter in scripted series. He published a memoir in essays and short-form reflections late in life, making sure he discussed career decisions, creative regrets, and decisions not taken. Why he declined BMI Lifetime Achievement in Pop unless his theatrical credits were equally cited. Why he refused reunion tours. Why he asked for equal billing in future retrospective anthologies. Holmes expressed that he's not resentful of fans, nor envious of younger songwriters. He said the song that defined him also freed him, but also framed him. What he hoped beyond everything was context, complexity, and choice. If you only speak one verse of someone's song, you lose everything after it. He hopes future interviews ask about that story. Not only the song, but what came next. He wants the people who discovered him through piña coladas to discover his novels, musicals, and TV work. He even expressed curiosity. If someone hears Escape and then buys Mistakes Were Made, I feel less afraid. At 78, Rupert Holmes reclaimed a legacy truncated by one melody. In doing so, he taught the rest of us how to live beyond one defining moment. He finally spoke. He finally clarified. Rupert Holmes didn't let Escape erase him. He asked us to see beyond it. If you know the chorus, now dive deeper into the musicals, the novels, the stories still waiting. Subscribe, comment, discover. What other artists are lost behind their biggest hit?